In this chapter, I'm going to ask you to open your mind, or to keep an open mind. When we look at stratification in American schools, and when we compare to other countries around the globe, you have to be willing to accept that America is not always the land of opportunity. I know we're taught that it is, practically from the day we can talk. But just consider the possibility that processes in education, such as the process of stratification, make it almost impossible for everyone to have a shot at the American dream. First, let's look at the history of social class in America. In a nutshell, America was and still is considered to be the land of opportunity. Anyone can make it. That's the conventional wisdom. In 1835, Alexis de Tocqueville published Democracy in America, which further solidified public consciousness, both here and in Europe, that in America, everyone had a voice. Horace Mann, considered the founder of modern public education in the U.S., called education in 1848 the great equalizer, the balance wheel of the social machinery. Meanwhile, in Europe, and especially after going through two world wars, it was obvious to the Europeans that opportunities were not equal. There was a distinct working class that was separate from the middle and upper classes. The working class was organized, with labor unions working more or less as powerful units to protect workers, and the birth of the Labor Party to express workers' needs in politics. As a result, most European countries have governmental systems that are more democratic socialist than democratic capitalist, like America's, and stronger social and governmental systems to provide health care, education, family leave, etc., all things that the common worker has required. Now, let's zip back to America. Yes, the U.S. has labor unions, but they are really quite impotent compared to labor unions in Europe, and they get quite a bit of ridicule, too, so they don't have much power. The conventional wisdom in the U.S. is that anyone can become anything they want, and so there is little need for unions to protect the workers. If a worker doesn't like the way he's being treated, he can go back to school and train for something else. If a worker loses her job because the plant where she works is closing down, well, that's the way a capitalist economy works, and she needs to adapt to the changes. But that can be tough. And without much social or governmental support, it can be really difficult and expensive to cover the costs of school and training, to have money to pay bills while going to school, and so on. So that's the paradox of social class. In most European countries, by recognizing that there are social classes that have less money, they support people so that they can climb out of those lower social classes. In the United States, by refusing to accept social class distinctions, by saying that anyone can make it if they just try hard enough, we don't provide the support to people who would need it so that they can move out of the lower social classes. In other words, by ignoring social class distinctions, we perpetuate these social classes. Now, let's move the discussion back to education specifically. Class divisions are still recognized in those European states, and so their educational systems are structured around those class expectations. Students usually start taking tests around age 13 to 15 to decide what kinds of schools they'll best fit into. Perhaps a college preparatory school or a vocational technical track, and for the most part, whichever track a student starts down will be paid for by the state. Free college for everybody. But only if you are supposed to go to college. As a result of the lack of an organized working class in the U.S., or perhaps in spite of it, American education has grown up around a one-size-fits-all model. Yes, it's changing some now with differentiated curricula and magnet schools, but for the most part, it's still possible, at least in theory, for anyone to go anywhere, do anything. Imagine how parents would react, how would you react, if the U.S. Department of Education suddenly announced that every child would take aptitude tests in their teenage years that would determine which schools they could go to and what they could study. There would be anarchy, fire and brimstone raining down from the PTAs, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria. I'm not taking sides on either type of system, and I don't feel that you need to take a side either. Just be aware of how social class has evolved in the U.S. and the pros and cons in the American educational system, because that's going to make a big difference in understanding the reading in this unit. When we talk about stratification, we're talking about the ways in which different groups of people are separated according to some characteristic. You'll want to note the variables in stratification that are in Figure 3.1 because these are the variables that sociologists study all the time. Race and ethnic background, social class, sex or gender, age, attitudes, stereotypes, beliefs, and values. Lastly, Ballantyne and Hammack use some pretty complicated terms at times in this chapter. So I want to define what some of these mean and how they're measured. First, ability. It's a tough concept to measure, but it's usually something like tests. Test scores, prior achievement. So if I do well in math in the 3rd grade, that's a pretty good predictor of my ability to do well in math in the 4th grade. Academic performance can be measured by a student's grades or by things like standardized tests, but cultural bias can be built into either of those. Educational/occupational aspirations. This basically means goals. What are your goals in your education? What do you aspire to be in your career? Educational attainment. How far did you actually go in your education? Did you graduate from high school? That's one level of attainment. Did you go to college? And if so, did you graduate? That's another level of attainment. So that's it for now. I'll see you online.